The morning sun cast long shadows across the stone corridors of Kensington Palace as Sergeant Marcus Holt made his routine rounds. He had served in the Royal Protection Squad for 12 years, and his dedication to the royal family was unwavering. Marcus was known among his colleagues as someone who took his duties seriously, perhaps more seriously than most. He had watched Princess Charlotte grow from a toddler into a bright young girl, and he felt a protective instinct toward her that went beyond his professional obligations. On this particular Tuesday morning, everything seemed normal. The palace was buzzing with its usual activities. Staff members hurried through hallways carrying linens and breakfast trays. Gardeners tended to the roses in the courtyard below. Marcus nodded to familiar faces as he walked his assigned route, his trained eyes scanning for anything out of place. Princess Charlotte had a ballet lesson scheduled for 9 o'clock that morning. She loved ballet and had been taking lessons for 2 years. Her instructor, Miss Victoria Wells, was a renowned former prima ballerina who had taught several members of aristocratic families. The princess always looked forward to these lessons. Arriving early with her small pink ballet bag and her hair neatly tied back, Marcus noticed Charlotte walking toward the practice room with her nanny, Mrs. Eleanor Foster. The young princess was chattering excitedly about a new routine she had been practicing. Her enthusiasm made Marcus's smile despite his serious demeanor. He watched them enter the studio, converted sitting room on the palace's second floor that had been outfitted with mirrors and a ballet bar. The lesson was scheduled to last an hour. Marcus positioned himself near the corridor, within earshot of the studio, but giving the princess her privacy during instruction. This was standard protocol. He could hear the faint sound of classical music beginning to play from within the room, 20 minutes into the lesson. Marcus heard something that made his blood run cold. It was a sharp cry, followed by complete silence. The music continued to play, but there were no other sounds. No footsteps, no instruction, no movement. His instincts immediately went on high alert. He moved closer to the door, his hand instinctively reaching for his radio. Marcus knocked firmly on the door. No response came. He knocked again, louder this time, announcing himself clearly. Still nothing. The music played on, a haunting melody that now seemed ominous in the silence. His heart began to pound as worst-case scenarios flooded his mind. He tried the door handle. It was locked from the inside. This was highly unusual. There was no reason for the door to be locked during a lesson. Marcus radioed for backup and made the decision that would change everything. Using his master key, reserved only for emergencies, he unlocked the door and pushed it open. The sight that greeted him made his entire body tense with rage. Princess Charlotte was sitting on the floor in the corner of the room, her face tear-streaked and her small body trembling. Her ballet outfit was disheveled, and there were red marks on her arms. Miss Wells stood near the bar, her face flushed, and her expression one of barely concealed annoyance. Marcus immediately moved to Charlotte's side, kneeling down to her level. The young princess looked up at him with frightened eyes, tears still streaming down her cheeks. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but seemed too scared to form words. Marcus gently asked her if she was hurt, his voice carefully controlled despite the fury building inside him. Before Charlotte could respond, Miss Wells stepped forward with a dismissive wave of her hand. She claimed that the princess was simply being dramatic, that she had corrected her posture too firmly, and the child had overreacted. Her tone was condescending, as if Marcus was interrupting something insignificant. She suggested he leave so they could continue the lesson. Marcus stood slowly, his full height and military bearing suddenly very apparent. He informed Miss Wells that the lesson was over and that she needed to step away from the princess immediately. His voice was calm but carried an unmistakable edge of authority. The instructor began to protest, claiming that she had taught nobility for years and knew how to handle sensitive children. That was when Marcus noticed more details that made his jaw clench. There was a small bruise forming on Charlotte's shoulder. The red marks on her arms were clearly finger marks, as if she had been grabbed roughly. The princess's water bottle lay spilled on the floor, and several of her personal items were scattered, as if there had been some kind of struggle or forceful interaction. Marcus radioed for medical assistance, and for senior palace security to report to the studio immediately. Miss Wells's demeanor shifted from annoyed to nervous. She began insisting that everything had been a misunderstanding, that sometimes discipline in ballet required firm handling, that the princess needed to learn proper form, and that required strict correction. But Marcus had seen enough in his years of service to recognize the difference between strict teaching and something far worse. He positioned himself between the instructor and Charlotte, his protective instincts in full force. He told Miss Wells in no uncertain terms that she was not to move, not to speak, and certainly not to come anywhere near the princess again. Other guards arrived within minutes, followed by palace officials and a medical staff member. Charlotte was gently examined while Miss Wells was escorted to a separate room for questioning. Marcus stayed with the young princess, speaking to her softly and reassuring her that she was safe now. As the medical examination continued, more concerning details emerged. There were additional marks that suggested Charlotte had been grabbed multiple times during the lesson. The physician noted that the bruising patterns were consistent with an adult's grip. Charlotte, when finally able to speak through her tears, described how Miss Wells had become angry when she couldn't execute a particular turn correctly. The princess explained in her small, shaking voice that the instructor had grabbed her arm and twisted it to demonstrate the proper position. When Charlotte cried out in pain, Miss Wells had reportedly told her that royal children don't cry, that she needed to be tougher, and that if she told anyone, no one would believe her because adults in positions of authority are always trusted over children. Marcus felt his hands form into fists as he listened to Charlotte's account. The calculated nature of the abuse, the psychological manipulation, the physical harm done to a child under the guise of instruction made his blood boil. This wasn't stern teaching or high standards. This was a clear case of someone abusing their position of trust and authority over a vulnerable child. Palace officials immediately contacted Princess Charlotte's parents. The atmosphere in the palace shifted dramatically from routine operations to crisis management. Staff members who had witnessed Miss Wells arriving and leaving over the past months were questioned about whether they had noticed anything concerning. Several admitted that the instructor had seemed unusually strict, and that they had occasionally heard raised voices from the studio during lessons. But they had assumed it was simply the nature of professional dance. Instruction: Marcus remained with Charlotte until her parents arrived. When they rushed into the room, the young princess finally broke down completely, running into her mother's arms and sobbing. The sight of her parents seemed to release all the fear and pain she had been holding inside. Marcus stood back, giving the family their moment. But his mind was already racing through everything that had happened. He thought about all the previous lessons, all the times Charlotte had seemed quieter than usual after ballet. He remembered one day when she had seemed hesitant to go to her lesson, but everyone had assumed she was just tired. The guilt of not recognizing the signs earlier weighed heavily on him. Even though he knew he had no way of knowing what was happening behind that closed door, senior palace security officials began a full investigation immediately. They reviewed security footage from the corridors. Though there were no cameras inside the practice room itself to protect the privacy of the royal family, they examined Miss Wells's background more thoroughly and discovered that while her credentials as a ballet instructor were legitimate, there had been vague complaints from previous students at other institutions. Nothing concrete enough to bar her from teaching, but enough to paint a concerning picture when viewed in hindsight. Ms. Wells was questioned extensively by palace security and later by police. Her story kept changing. First, she maintained that nothing inappropriate had happened. Then she admitted to being perhaps too firm, but insisted it was necessary for proper instruction. Eventually, when faced with the medical evidence and Charlotte's testimony, she claimed that the princess was simply too sensitive and that her methods were standard in professional ballet training. Marcus provided his detailed account of discovering the situation, including his observations of Charlotte's condition and the instructor's behavior. His military training had taught him to remain objective and factual, but anyone reading his report could sense the controlled anger beneath every word. He made it clear that, in his professional opinion, what he witnessed went far beyond strict teaching and crossed into abuse. The investigation moved swiftly once palace officials realized the full extent of what had occurred. Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell, from the Metropolitan Police, was assigned to the case, given its sensitive nature involving a member of the royal family. She arrived at Kensington Palace within hours of the incident being reported. Bringing with her a specialist in child abuse cases, Marcus was among the first people Detective Mitchell interviewed. He sat across from her in a private office, recounting every detail of that morning with the precision his military background had instilled in him. He described the cry he had heard, the locked door, the scene he discovered when he entered. Mitchell noticed how his jaw tightened when he spoke about seeing Charlotte huddled in the corner, how his hands clenched when he described the marks on her small arms. The detective had interviewed as many witnesses in her career, but she could see that this case had affected Marcus personally. He wasn't just a guard doing his duty. He had formed a bond with the young princess over the years, watching her grow up within the palace walls. The violation of trust and the harm done to a child he had sworn to protect clearly weighed on him. Heavily, Mitchell asked Marcus about previous interactions with Miss Wells. He admitted that he had always found her cold and rigid, but he had attributed it to professional strictness rather than anything sinister. She demanded absolute quiet during lessons and insisted that no one, not even palace staff, interrupt her sessions with Charlotte. At the time, this had seemed like the behavior of a perfectionist instructor. Now, in retrospect, it appeared to be someone creating an environment where abuse could occur without witnesses. The detective then interviewed other palace staff members who had regular contact with the ballet studio area. A housekeeping staff member named Maria Rodriguez provided particularly troubling testimony. She recalled entering the studio once to retrieve a forgotten cleaning cart and seeing Miss Wells standing very close to Charlotte, speaking to her in a low, intense voice that seemed more threatening than instructional. When Maria had apologized for the interruption, Miss Wells had snapped at her to get out, her face flushed with what appeared to be barely controlled anger. Another staff member, a young footman named Thomas Green, mentioned that he had twice heard crying coming from the studio during lessons over the past month. He had reported it to his supervisor, who had dismissed it as normal for children learning challenging skills. Thomas felt guilty now for not pushing the matter further, for not insisting that someone check on the princess. His testimony revealed a systemic problem in how concerns about the instructor had been dismissed or rationalized away by palace officials who assumed that someone of Miss Wells's reputation must know what she was doing. Mrs. Eleanor Foster, Charlotte's nanny, was devastated when she learned what had been happening. She had always accompanied Charlotte to the studio and waited outside during lessons. She told Detective Mitchell that Charlotte had recently become less enthusiastic about ballet, which she had initially loved. The princess had started making excuses about why she couldn't attend lessons, claiming she felt sick or had too much homework. Mrs. Foster had gently encouraged her to continue, thinking it was normal for children to sometimes lose interest in activities. The guilt of having pushed Charlotte to attend lessons, where she was being harmed, was almost unbearable for the devoted nanny. Detective Mitchell conducted a lengthy, sensitive interview with Princess Charlotte herself. With her parents present and a child psychologist supporting the process, Charlotte was remarkably brave for her age as she described what had been happening over the past several weeks. She explained that Miss Wells had become increasingly aggressive in her teaching methods, starting with harsh verbal criticism and escalating to physical corrections that hurt. The princess described how the instructor would grab her limbs and force them into positions, ignoring her cries of pain. Miss Wells told her repeatedly that ballet required suffering, that all great dancers had endured similar treatment, and that Charlotte's complaints showed weakness, unbefitting a royal. The psychological manipulation was as disturbing as the physical abuse. The instructor had systematically worked to isolate Charlotte, convincing her that reporting the abuse would result in punishment for being a tattletale and that no one would believe her. Anyway, Charlotte revealed that the morning Marcus found her had been the worst incident yet. She had been unable to perform a difficult leap to Miss Wells's satisfaction. The instructor had lost her temper completely. She had grabbed Charlotte by both arms and shaken her, leaving the marks Marcus had discovered. When Charlotte had cried, Miss Wells had shoved her toward the corner and told her to stay there until she could behave like a proper princess. That was when Charlotte had let out the cry that alerted Marcus to the situation. The investigation expanded to include Miss Wells's previous teaching positions. Detective Mitchell contacted ballet schools and private clients where the instructor had worked before coming to the palace. What emerged was a troubling pattern. Several former students reported that Miss Wells had been excessively harsh. Though none had reported physical abuse as clear as what Charlotte had experienced. Some parents mentioned that their children had become afraid of lessons and had asked to quit ballet. One mother recalled her daughter developing anxiety attacks before class. But when she had confronted Miss Wells about possibly being too strict, the instructor had become defensive and resigned from the position. Before any formal complaint could be filed, the pattern suggested that Miss Wells had learned to operate in a gray area, being harsh enough to intimidate children, but stopping just short of leaving obvious evidence until this incident with Charlotte. The prestige of teaching a royal student may have emboldened her to push boundaries further than she had before. Believing that her position would protect her from consequences, Marcus found himself struggling with the aftermath of the discovery. He took his responsibilities seriously. And the fact that a child had been harmed while under palace protection felt like a personal failure. His commanding officer, Captain Jonathan Reynolds, sat down with him to discuss the situation. Reynolds assured Marcus that he had acted appropriately and had in fact prevented what could have been even worse. Abuse, if it had continued undetected, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he should have noticed something sooner. He replayed every interaction, every time he had seen Charlotte heading to her lesson or leaving the studio. Had there been signs he had missed? Could he have intervened earlier if he had been more observant? Captain Reynolds reminded him that abusers are skilled at hiding their actions and that second-guessing himself wasn't productive. What mattered was that Marcus had trusted his instincts. When he heard that cry and had acted decisively to protect Charlotte, the palace issued a statement acknowledging that an incident had occurred involving inappropriate treatment of Princess Charlotte by a private instructor who had been immediately dismissed and was under investigation by police. They emphasized that the well-being of all royal family members, especially the children, was their highest priority and that all safety protocols were being reviewed to prevent such situations in the future. The media firestorm that followed was intense. Reporters camped outside palace gates, demanding more information. Child safety advocates praised the quick action taken but questioned how such abuse could have occurred within royal residences in the first place. The incident sparked broader conversations about child safety in private instruction settings and the vulnerability of children when authority figures abuse their positions. Miss Victoria Wells was arrested and charged with child abuse and assault. Her lawyer attempted to argue that her methods, while perhaps overly strict, were within the bounds of professional dance instruction, and that the situation had been blown out of proportion due to the high-profile nature of the victim. However, the medical evidence, Charlotte's testimony, and the accounts from palace staff painted a clear picture of systematic abuse rather than mere strictness. Marcus attended every court hearing he was permitted to observe. He wanted Miss Wells to see him there, to know that someone was watching and that her actions hadn't gone unnoticed or unpunished. During one hearing, their eyes met across the courtroom. Marcus's expression was one of controlled fury, and Miss Wells quickly looked away, unable to hold his gaze. The trial revealed even more disturbing details. Expert witnesses in child psychology testified about the long-term impact of the type of abuse Charlotte had experienced. They explained how perpetrators often use positions of authority and trust to manipulate children into silence. The prosecution built a compelling case that Miss Wells had engaged in a pattern of escalating abuse, using the privacy of the locked studio and her prestigious reputation to create an environment where she had complete control. Princess Charlotte had to testify. A process that was made as gentle as possible, but was still traumatic for a young child. She spoke through video link with her parents beside her, describing what had happened. Her testimony was heartbreaking in its simplicity and honesty. She explained that she had loved ballet before Miss Wells became mean, and now she was afraid of dancing because it reminded her of those lessons. Marcus watched the video testimony from the courtroom and found himself having to step outside briefly to compose himself. The impact of the abuse on this bright, enthusiastic child was profound. Her innocence had been violated, her trust betrayed, and her love of something she'd enjoyed had been corrupted by someone who was supposed to nurture her talents. The palace implemented sweeping changes to their protocols for private instructors and staff who worked with royal children. All lessons would now have observation windows or be conducted in spaces where monitoring was possible. Background checks would be more thorough, including speaking directly with previous students and parents, rather than just verifying credentials. Any staff member who witnessed concerning behavior was encouraged. It's expected to report it immediately, without fear of repercussions for being wrong. Marcus was asked to help develop new security protocols, specifically focused on protecting the younger royals from potential abuse by instructors or staff members who had access to them. His first-hand experience with the incident made him uniquely qualified to identify potential vulnerabilities in the system. He threw himself into the work, determined that no other child under palace protection would experience what Charlotte had gone through. The weeks following the incident brought profound changes to life within Kensington Palace. Marcus noticed how different Charlotte seemed as she moved through the corridors with her nanny. The bright, chattering child who had once greeted him with enthusiastic waves now walked more quietly. Staying closer to Mrs. Foster, her parents had arranged for her to see a child therapist who specialized in trauma. And while she was making progress, the emotional scars from the abuse were clearly taking time to heal. Marcus made a point of being visible and friendly. Whenever he encountered Charlotte during his rounds, he wanted her to know that not all adults would hurt her, that there were people whose job was genuinely to keep her safe. Sometimes she would give him a small smile, and those moments felt like victories. Other times, she would just nod politely and continue walking. Lost in her own thoughts, the trial of Miss Victoria Wells continued to dominate headlines. As more evidence was presented, the full picture of her abusive methods became public. Former students from her previous positions came forward, emboldened by Charlotte's brave testimony. They described similar experiences of being grabbed roughly, verbally berated, and psychologically manipulated. The pattern was undeniable. Miss Wells had spent years abusing children under the guise of rigorous stalls professional instruction. One particularly damaging piece of evidence came from the palace's security system. While there were no cameras inside the ballet studio itself, the corridor cameras had captured Miss Wells's demeanor before and after lessons. Video footage showed her entering the studio with a cold, controlled expression and leaving with visible frustration and anger on multiple occasions. On the morning of the incident, Marcus discovered the footage showed her face was flushed. Red and her movements were agitated when she had locked the door from inside. The prosecution also presented a journal that had been found during a search of Miss Wells's residence. In it, she had written about her frustration with students who couldn't meet her standards and her belief that modern children were too coddled and needed a harsh discipline to achieve excellence. Some entries specifically mentioned Princess Charlotte, describing her as spoiled and in need of being taught that royalty didn't excuse weakness. The journal entries revealed a disturbing mindset that viewed children as objects to be molded through force, rather than students to be nurtured. Marcus was called to testify during the trial. He stood in the witness box wearing his formal uniform, his posture military straight, his voice clear and steady as he recounted the events of that morning. The defense attorney attempted to suggest that he had overreacted to what was simply a strict teaching session, but Marcus was unshakable in his testimony. He described the fear in Charlotte's eyes, the bruising on her body, the tears streaming down her face. He explained that in his 12 years of service, he had never seen a child in such visible distress from a legitimate educational session. When the defense attorney pressed him about whether he might have misinterpreted the situation, Marcus looked directly at the jury. He said that he had been trained to assess threats and recognize when someone was in danger. The scene he had discovered that morning was not a case of strict teaching. It was a clear case of a child who had been harmed and was terrified. His testimony carried weight precisely because he was not given to exaggeration or emotional reactions. He was a professional describing a Professional assessment of a dangerous situation. The prosecution's closing arguments were powerful. They pointed out that Miss Wells had systematically abused her position of trust, targeting vulnerable children, including a member of the royal family. They emphasized that her actions weren't moments of losing control, but part of a calculated pattern of behavior, designed to intimidate children into silence while satisfying her own need for absolute control. The psychological manipulation, they argued, was in some ways even more damaging than the physical abuse because it taught children not to trust their own instincts about what was wrong. The jury deliberated for less than a day. When they returned with their verdict, Marcus was in the courtroom. He watched as the foreman stood and pronounced Miss Victoria Wells guilty on all counts of child abuse and assault. The instructor's face went pale, but she showed no real emotion beyond shock at being held accountable for her actions. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later, and Miss Wells was remanded into custody. Marcus felt a sense of grim satisfaction as he watched her being led away. Justice was being served, though he knew it couldn't undo the harm that had been done to Charlotte and the other children she had abused over the years. But it might prevent her from hurting anyone else. And it sent a message that abusing children would have consequences regardless of one's professional reputation or out prestigious clients. The sentencing hearing brought closure to the legal proceedings. The judge delivered a scathing statement before announcing the sentence. She spoke about the sacred trust placed in teachers and instructors, especially those working with children. She noted that Miss Wells had not only violated that trust, but had deliberately used it as a tool for abuse. The judge mentioned that while professional instruction could be demanding, there was a clear line between high standards and cruelty, between discipline and abuse. And Miss Wells had crossed that line repeatedly and deliberately. Miss Victoria Wells was sentenced to 4 years in prison, followed by a permanent ban from working with children in any capacity. She was also required to register as a child offender, which would restrict her movements and activities upon release. The sentence was stronger than some had expected, but the judge made clear that abuse of children would not be treated lightly, especially when committed by someone in a position of trust and authority. Marcus attended the sentencing with several other palace security staff members. When the sentence was announced, he felt some of the tension he had been carrying for weeks finally release. It wasn't everything he might have hoped for, but it was justice. Charlotte and the other victims had been heard and believed. Their abuser would face consequences. Back at the palace, life was slowly finding a new normal. Princess Charlotte continued her therapy sessions and was gradually regaining her confidence. Her parents had decided not to push her toward any structured activities for a while, letting her explore interests at her own pace without pressure. She had expressed interest in art classes, and they were carefully vetting potential instructors with the new, stricter protocols that had been implemented. Marcus was awarded a commendation for his actions in protecting Princess Charlotte. During a private ceremony attended by senior palace officials and security staff, Captain Reynolds praised Marcus for his vigilance and his decisive action when faced with a potential threat to a royal family member. The commendation would become part of his permanent service record, recognizing his dedication to duty and his instinctive understanding of when something was wrong. Charlotte's parents also personally thanked Marcus. The meeting was informal, held in one of the palace's private sitting rooms. They expressed their deep gratitude for his protection of their daughter and his role in stopping the abuse. They acknowledged that discovering what had happened had been difficult for everyone, but that Marcus's actions had potentially saved Charlotte from even worse harm. The conversation was emotional, and Marcus found himself having to control his own feelings as they discussed how their daughter was recovering. The incident had a ripple effect throughout royal households and aristocratic families across the country. Many families began reviewing their own protocols for private instructors and coaches. Background checks became more thorough. References were verified more carefully. Parents became more alert to signs that their children might be uncomfortable with instructors. The case had shown a light on a vulnerability that many had not fully considered before. Marcus noticed changes in how the entire security team approached their duties. There was a renewed emphasis on protecting not just the physical safety of royal family members, but their emotional well-being as well. Security staff were given training on recognizing signs of abuse and understanding that threats to the royals could come from trusted insiders, not just external dangers. The assumption that anyone with proper credentials and a prestigious background must be trustworthy had been proven dangerously false. Several months after the incident, Marcus encountered Charlotte in the palace gardens. She was with Mrs. Foster, looking at the roses that were in full bloom. When she saw Marcus, she walked over to him with more confidence than he had seen from her in weeks. She thanked him quietly for helping her that day, her voice small but steady. She said she had been scared, but knowing he was there had made her feel safer. Marcus knelt down to her level, as he had on that terrible morning. But this time, Charlotte's eyes held trust instead of fear. He told her that protecting her was his job and his honor, and that she never had to be afraid to tell someone if anyone ever made her feel unsafe again. He promised that people would listen and believe her. Charlotte nodded seriously and then surprised him by giving him a quick hug before returning to Mrs. Foster and the roses. That moment stayed with Marcus. It represented healing, not complete, but progressing. It reminded him why he had chosen this career, why the work mattered. Protecting people, especially vulnerable children, from those who would harm them, was more than just a job. It was a calling. The palace commissioned an independent review of all their child safety protocols. The resulting report made dozens of recommendations, many of which Marcus had already incorporated into his own protocol proposals. The recommendations included mandatory observation methods for all private instruction, regular check-ins with children about their comfort levels with instructors, training for all staff on recognizing abuse signs, and clear reporting channels that encourage staff to voice concerns without fear of repercussions. Marcus was asked to serve on the committee implementing these new protocols. He worked closely with child safety experts, psychologists, and education specialists to create a system that balanced the privacy and dignity of royal children with robust safeguards against potential abuse. The goal was to ensure that what happened to Charlotte would never happen to any child under palace. Protection again. A year after the incident, the changes implemented at Kensington Palace had become standard practice. The new protocols were working well. It's creating an environment where children's safety was prioritized without making them feel constantly monitored or restricted. Marcus had been promoted to Senior Security Coordinator for Royal Family Protection, a role that allowed him to oversee safety measures across all royal residences. Princess Charlotte had made remarkable progress in her recovery. She had started taking art classes with a carefully vetted instructor, and her natural creativity was flourishing in this new outlet. The lessons were conducted in an open studio space with large windows, and Mrs. Foster was always present. Charlotte seemed to genuinely enjoy these sessions, arriving with the same enthusiasm she had once shown for ballet before Miss Wells had destroyed that joy. Marcus often reflected on how the incident had changed his perspective on protection work. He had always been vigilant about external threats, trained to watch for suspicious individuals or dangerous situations from outside the palace. But the Miss Wells case had taught him that sometimes the greatest dangers came from those who were welcomed inside. People with credentials and reputations who used their access to harm rather than help. He had shared these insights. During training sessions with new security recruits, he told them about the importance of trusting their instincts, about recognizing that threats could come from unexpected sources, and about the responsibility they carried to protect vulnerable individuals from all forms of harm. His story about discovering Charlotte's situation had become part of the training curriculum, used to illustrate why vigilance had to extend beyond traditional security concerns. The broader impact of the case continued to unfold. Child protection organizations had used Miss Wells's conviction as a catalyst for pushing reforms in private instruction industries. Several professional organizations for dance instructors, music teachers, and sports coaches implemented new codes of conduct, explicitly prohibiting physical punishment or psychological intimidation. Background check requirements became more stringent, and continuing education on appropriate teaching methods and boundary maintenance became mandatory. Some instructors complained that the new requirements were excessive, but the vast majority of professional teachers welcomed the changes. They recognized that clear standards protected both students and good teachers by establishing unambiguous boundaries and creating decent accountability. The Miss Wells case had cast a shadow over the entire private instruction industry, and legitimate professionals wanted to rebuild trust by demonstrating their commitment to child safety. Marcus received letters from parents around the AS country thanking him for his actions and for bringing attention to an issue many had not fully considered. Some shared their own stories of children who had been mistreated by instructors, situations they had not recognized as abuse until the Charlotte case had raised awareness. Several mentioned that they had removed their children from concerning situations after hearing about the case and recognizing similar warning signs. One letter particularly moved Marcus. It was from the mother of a young gymnast who had been experiencing similar abuse from her coach. After hearing about Charlotte's case, the mother had paid closer attention to her daughter's reluctance to attend practice and had discovered bruising similar to what Charlotte had sustained. The coach was now under investigation, and the mother credited Marcus's actions with giving her the awareness and courage to investigate her own daughter's situation. Reading these letters reinforced for Marcus that his decision to burst through that locked door had consequences far beyond protecting one princess. It had sparked a broader conversation about child safety and had potentially helped protect countless other children. The public nature of the case, involving a royal family member, had given it a platform that similar cases involving ordinary children rarely received. If something positive could come from Charlotte's trauma, it was that her experience had opened eyes and changed systems in ways that would benefit many others. Charlotte herself was finding her voice in the aftermath of her experience. With her therapist's guidance and her parents' support, she had begun speaking about what had happened in age-appropriate ways. She participated in a child-safe video about recognizing when adults are being inappropriate, a resource that would be used in schools to help other children understand their rights and their ability to speak up when something felt wrong. In the video, Charlotte spoke about how Miss Wells had told her that telling would get her in trouble, and how she had learned that was a lie adults sometimes use to keep children quiet. She emphasized that children should always tell a trusted adult if someone is hurting them or making them uncomfortable, and that real grown-ups will listen and help. Her willingness to share her story, even in this limited way, demonstrated remarkable courage and a desire to help others avoid what she had experienced. Marcus was moved when he watched the video during a security briefing about child protection resources. Seeing Charlotte speaking confidently about her experience, using her platform as a princess to help other children, showed how far she had come. The frightened, crying child he had found in that studio had transformed into a young girl determined to ensure others wouldn't suffer as she had. The palace arranged for Marcus to meet with other royal protection officers from different countries to share the lessons learned from the Charlotte case. He traveled to several European capitals, presenting at conferences about insider threats and the importance of comprehensive protection strategies that went beyond physical security. His presentations were well received, and several other royal households implemented similar protocol changes based on his recommendations. During one of these conferences in Copenhagen, a security officer from the Swedish royal household approached Marcus privately. She shared that they had recently discovered a similar situation with a music tutor who had been verbally abusing one of the young Swedish royals. Inspired by how the Charlotte case had been handled, they had taken immediate action, removed the tutor, and implemented new safeguards. She thanked Marcus for his willingness to speak openly about the case, as it had provided them with a framework for addressing their own situation effectively. These international connections strengthened Marcus's resolve that child protection had to be a priority everywhere, not just in his own area of responsibility. He began working with child safety organizations to develop best practices that could be applied in various settings, from schools to private instruction to youth sports programs. His unique perspective as someone who had directly intervened in an abuse situation gave his recommendations credibility. Back at Kensington Palace, a subtle but meaningful change had occurred in how security staff interacted with the royal children. There There was a warmer, more engaged presence, rather than the previous more distant professional demeanor. Guards made eye contact, exchanged friendly greetings, created an atmosphere where children would feel comfortable approaching them if needed. This shift made the children feel protected, rather than just monitored. Charlotte seemed to particularly appreciate this change. She had developed a friendly rapport with several security staff members beyond Marcus. She would chat with them about her art projects or her school activities, treating them as friendly presences in her life rather than invisible guards. This openness meant that if she ever felt uncomfortable or unsafe again, she had multiple people she trusted enough to tell. Marcus observed these interactions with satisfaction. Creating an environment where children felt genuinely protected, rather than just surveilled, had been one of his key recommendations. Security staff were now trained not just in threat detection, but in building appropriate, professional relationships with the family members they protected. This approach meant that children would be more likely to confide in guards if something was wrong, turning the security team into an extended network of watchful, caring adults. The art instructor working with Charlotte was aware of the history and took special care to create a positive, encouraging environment. She praised Charlotte's efforts, offered gentle guidance, and never pushed her beyond what she was comfortable attempting. Watching Charlotte flourish in these sessions, seeing her confidence in her creative abilities grow, provided clear evidence that with the right support and environment, she was moving beyond the trauma of her experience with Miss Wells. On the second anniversary of the incident, Marcus found himself walking past the old ballet studio, which had been converted into a music room. The mirrors had been removed, and the space had been completely transformed. Princess Charlotte no longer had any reason to enter that space, and the physical reminder of her trauma had been erased. Marcus approved of this decision. Sometimes places carry memories that make healing more difficult, and the palace had wisely chosen to repurpose the space entirely. He thought about how far everyone had come in 2 years. Charlotte was thriving, the security protocols were stronger, and awareness about child safety in private instruction settings had increased significantly. Miss Wells was still in prison, serving her sentence, and would be there for some time yet. The other children she had abused had also received support and counseling, and several had returned to ballet with different instructors who helped them rediscover their love of dance. Marcus had learned important lessons from the experience as well. He had learned that protecting someone meant being alert to all forms of harm, not just the obvious physical threats. He had learned the importance of trusting instincts, even when a situation seemed unlikely or when challenging someone with credentials and authority. He had learned that sometimes the most important action a protector could take was to simply be present and pay attention to details that others might dismiss. Captain Reynolds called Marcus into his office one afternoon with news that Marcus was being considered for a national award recognizing his service in child protection. The nomination had come from child safety advocates who had been impressed by his actions and his subsequent work on developing better protection protocols. Marcus was honored by the nomination, but felt uncomfortable with the attention. He had simply done his job, responded to a situation that demanded action. Reynolds smiled at Marcus's modest response, but pointed out that many people might have hesitated, might have doubted their interpretation of the situation, might have worried about offending a prestigious instructor or overstepping their authority. Marcus had put the child's safety first without hesitation, and that instinct deserved recognition. The award, Reynolds noted, would also draw more attention to the importance of comprehensive child protection measures, which aligned with Marcus's ongoing work. Princess Charlotte learned about the award nomination and asked if she could write a letter of support. Her parents agreed, and she composed a heartfelt note describing how Marcus had helped her on one of the scariest days of her life and how his actions had shown her that there were adults who would always protect children. The letter was included in the nomination package and proved to be one of the most moving testimonials. When the award was announced, Marcus received it at a ceremony attended by child safety advocates, law enforcement officials, and education leaders. He accepted the award humbly, using his speech to emphasize that every adult had a responsibility to watch out for children's well-being and to speak up when something seemed wrong. He challenged everyone present to look beyond credentials and reputations when assessing whether children were safe. to listen to children's concerns, and to create environments where children felt comfortable reporting when adults made them uncomfortable. The ceremony was covered by media, and Marcus's message reached a wide audience. Several news stories followed up on the impact of the Charlotte case, highlighting how the increased awareness had led to other abusive situations being discovered and stopped. Child protection helplines reported an increase in calls from both children and concerned adults who had been inspired by the case to take action. Charlotte watched the coverage of the ceremony with her parents. She was proud that Marcus was being recognized, and proud that her own difficult experience had led to positive changes. Her therapist had worked with her on reframing the narrative, helping her see herself not as a victim but as someone whose bravery in speaking up had helped others. This perspective aided her ongoing healing and gave meaning to what she had endured. Years would pass, and Charlotte would grow into a confident young woman. She would eventually speak publicly about her experience in more detail, using her platform to advocate for child safety reforms. She would credit Marcus not just with rescuing her that day, but with showing her what true protection and genuine care looked like. His actions had taught her that she deserved to be safe, that adults who hurt children were wrong, regardless of their reasons, and that speaking up about abuse was always the right choice. Marcus continued his work in security, eventually retiring after 25 years of service. He remained involved in child protection advocacy, serving on advisory boards and continuing to train security professionals on comprehensive protection strategies. The incident with Princess Charlotte remained the defining moment of his career, not because of its high-profile nature, but because it had reinforced his understanding of what protection truly meant. In quiet moments, Marcus would think about that morning when he had heard Charlotte's cry through the studio door. He would think about the decision to enter despite protocols about privacy. It's about the scene he had discovered, and about the fury he had felt at seeing a child harmed by someone entrusted with her care. He had no regrets about any of his actions that day. When faced with a child in danger, there had been no choice but to act decisively and immediately. The locked door that had once hidden abuse had been opened, and in its opening, light had been shed not just on one situation but on systemic vulnerabilities that needed addressing. Charlotte's story had become a catalyst for change, and Marcus's role in bringing that story to light had rippled outward in ways he could never have anticipated when he first heard that cry, and made the decision that would change everything.